It's time
for 15 minutes of non-stop MMA, tackling the biggest news in the sport. Head into the chat and let us know how you feel. Live from Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, here's your host, Craig Allen.
Oh boy, what a time to be a fan of mixed martial arts. All right, so as always, one half of your hosting duo at Craig Allen FNP. You can find me there on Instagram and Twitter as well. Missing Matt. Matt had a busy weekend of nobody showing up to the market that he works at. Now, in terms of today's show, typically question mark kicks we save for the day of the fights. Yesterday, of course, you had such a weird, wild day. You didn't really know if the card was actually going to happen from Brasilia, Brazil. But of course it did. And to start off the show, we're going to get into a recap of the card. Of course, it went on without a hitch almost. I mean, yeah, we had the one draw, but it was a great fight. And we had plenty of decisions, but they were great fights. So we'll talk about those to start off the show. We're also going to give a UFC London update. We're going to bring in one of my favorite segments from one of the other shows this week in MMA. That segment being the Twitter Purge. So we'll get into the Twitter Purge. We'll figure out where that card sits right now. We're also going to talk about the coronavirus and MMA. I had the chance last night to appear on Sportsnet's The Fan 590 national radio broadcast up here in Canada to talk MMA. I noticed they had James Lynch on there today, so kudos to them. But it was a little weird. It was weird to get the DM that they wanted me to appear on there, which was awesome, and so glad I could have been on there. But hey, MMA doesn't typically get a shine like that, and it was really the only game in town, so I had the chance to talk about that. We'll get into coronavirus and MMA. We'll also get into future events and where they sit. And then we'll get into your fight night picks. So if you have maybe potential matchups that you want to see, maybe have some different stuff that you want to bring up, we'll get into those to end the show. If you want to head into the chat, let us know what you're thinking. Let me know what you're thinking, I guess, today. In terms of UFC Brasilia, in terms of UFC London, and then the coronavirus that's pretty well decimated all of sports as it is right now for the time being. Now, with UFC Brasilia, what a card. Awesome card. If we go all the way back through, and we look at it, wow. I mean, it was incredibly enjoyable. You look at some of the fights, I mean, even kicking it off. All right, so we had Bia Malecki take on Veronica Macedo. I know a lot of people weren't overly excited for that fight. I know it wasn't the most entertaining of fight up until maybe the last minute or 45 seconds. Bia Malecki pulling out the unanimous decision win. A lot of people were on the fence about that one just based on the way that it took place and in terms of how the whole card would kind of start to roll from there. But of course, after that, we had David Dvorak taking on Bruno Silva. That was an awesome fight. I know in terms of the picks, I updated them down below in the description. Matt, so far this year, 58 of 103. I'm 65 of 104. I had one extra pick with NEF 42, the Manny Bermudez, Bruce Boynton card when I was away. So had the chance to talk about that one. And Well Lad says, who do you want to see fight Woodley this week? I'm going to touch on that in the UFC London update. But I've got a couple of people who've thrown their names in the hat and one that I'm going to go with in particular. But in terms of the picks so far this year, we're pretty much on par with where we were last year, a little bit below our average from last year. But nonetheless, they've been going quite well. And in terms of this card, like I said, Matt went, He went 6 out of 11. I count as 11 because we had the one draw. You kind of pushed that one aside. I went 8 of 11. So it was a pretty good weekend in terms of that. But this card, great card. I mean, we had some really good fights. Marina Moroz over Mayra Bueno Silva. She looked great. Marina Moroz did. Very, very fluid in her striking, but very accurate. I know in our predictions, Matt talked about it, the fact that Marina Moroz has had fights where her striking accuracy sits around 25%, but in that fight, she looked great. Then we had the draw between Hani Yahya and Enrica Barzola. I had it scored that way. Great fight there, as John Manfredi says, wow. Lee Wright, yeah, Lee was rough in the main event. So why don't we go all the way up to the main event then? Charles Oliveira, Kevin Lee was a fight that in terms of odds were really close. Again, on national radio last night, I said go with Kevin Lee as a pick. Boy, was I ever wrong. I mean, this guy, and I tweeted it out to our pal Kairos MMA over on Twitter, but I put a picture and wrote inconsistency in that. Man, Kevin Lee, just a picture of inconsistency since UFC 216 when he headlined against Tony Ferguson. Real shame the way that that fight went for him, especially for Faraz Sahabi and the team over at TriStar MMA in Canada. I mean, having Kevin Lee and Johnny Walker on the main card, really good opportunity to try and promote the brand, and bam, Nikita Krylov running through Johnny Walker, and Charles Oliveira doing the same thing with Kevin Lee. Of course, in terms of the bonus structure, you had Charles Oliveira and Gilbert Burns picking up performance bonuses. Fight of the night was Marina Moroz and Mayra Bueno Silva, but it was fairly one-sided in terms of the beatdown that Marina Moroz put down on Mayra Bueno Silva. So let me know. I mean, maybe you're not agreeing with the fight of the night. If it was me and I had to pick, I'd probably say, Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos and Alexei Kunchenko. That was a great fight. Zaleski getting the nod there. It was a really close one. Amanda Ribas absolutely running over the Iraqi-Canadian Randa Marcos. And it was very interesting. They were talking about it there on the broadcast. The fact that she trains in the Windsor area. She does a little bit of strength and conditioning here, a little bit here and there. And then she also trains across the border in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So it was kind of a shame for Randa Marcos, but again, it went with the trend of you win one, you lose one. And Amanda Ribas getting another big win there, 3-0 in the UFC cage. She's looked absolutely stellar since joining. And she called out Paige Van Zandt, who she was originally booked to face on this card. Van Zandt out due to injury, but Ribas ready to throw down at 115 or 125 pounds. So really looking forward to that. But if you had to ask me in terms of my fight of the night, Brandon Moreno, Jussier Formiga, that had to be the one. I mean, you talk about Jussier Formiga as a guy that he's right up there in that title picture. His last loss, of course, came to none other than Joseph Benavidez. And for Brandon Moreno, look, I know I'm gonna keep going with this narrative and toot my own horn, but the end of 2019, I said, Brandon Moreno, you watch. Even the fight against Askar Askarov, this is a guy that's going to go on a run, and he's going to be the champ by the end of 2020. And I'm going to keep saying it. We're going to see what happens. But Brandon Moreno, it was a close fight against UCA Formiga. I bet if there were fans in there, maybe it could have swayed the judges. But Brandon Moreno absolutely putting on a masterclass. Both of these guys so good in terms of grappling, and in the scrambles, you knew what was going to happen. But you look at a guy like Brandon Moreno, that's one of the most exciting fighters in the UFC right now. Even Jussier Formiga, and not to mention 125 pounds between this fight and the Dvorak-Bruno Silva fight. I mean, fireworks. So you couldn't have asked for anything better between those two fights. But Brandon Moreno getting the win most likely puts himself in a pretty darn good title conversation, you would have to think. But an awesome performance by the man, Brandon Moreno. Now, in terms of the next fight, you had Francisco Trinaldo, John Makdessi. Man, Canadians and adopted Canadians just did not do well on this Brasilia card. But Francisco Trinaldo and John Makdessi, it was a fight where Trinaldo pushed the pace. It was kind of strange, the fact that John Makdessi just continued on his back foot. And you think of the good John Makdessi performances. Like, think back to Calgary when he fought Ross Pearson, fight of the night. John Makdessi moved forward. Think about the fight against Lando Venata. Didn't go great. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But John Makdessi, like, if we pull up his record, I mean, the guy's 17-7 at this point, 34 years old. Lando Venata knocked him out. He was on his back foot. He beat Abel Trujillo, which I was very surprised that the UFC brought his name up. Then he beat Ross Pearson. Then he beat Jesus Pinedo. And then, yeah, he gets Francisco Trinaldo. And instead of looking great, he didn't look as great as he has recently. So, a little bit of a surprise there. But overall, really good card. I mean, then you also had Renato Moicano moving up to 155 pounds, fighting Damir Hadzovic, looking like lightning in a bottle. Renato Moicano, unless he's fighting the best of the best at 145, he's looked great. I mean, even think back to the Calvin Kattar fight. It was crazy to think that that guy then fought Aldo and then had another tough outing in his last one. But Renato Moicano, I mean, Korean Zombie fight didn't go great, but the fight against Damir Hadzovic certainly went his way. And now all of a sudden he's in the conversation at 155 pounds, calling guys out left, right, and center. And then we continue up. And I know, guys, F. Smith 99, Walker was so overrated. I mean, hey, he came into the UFC from Contender Series and lit the world on fire. And then all of a sudden you start to see some holes in his game. I mean, his wrestling and his grappling, not that great. You even go back and you look at his record and think to yourself and scratch your head. Back in 2015, he lost to Klidson Fajeas de Abreu, who hasn't looked all that great in the UFC at 265. So you think about it, I mean, yeah, Johnny Walker, wild and unpredictable. Krylov should have been the favorite there. And nobody mentioned the fact that Krylov could wrestle before the fight. Listen, I think we might have said it, but Krylov, man, really good pressure and a really, really good grappler. I mean, you look at his record, and out of the 20-odd wins, out of what is he now, 27 wins, 27-7, he has a ton of wins by submission. He has 15 wins by submission, 11 knockouts. He's a finisher. It's just when he faces that upper echelon at 205 pounds, that's where it gets to be a bit of an issue for Nikita Krylov. And Nikita Krylov as well was doing quite well, lost, and then he goes away. He just decides, you know what, I'm leaving the UFC. I'm going to take my talents elsewhere. Goes over, fights in Europe and in Russia, and looks awesome. And then he comes back, and he was 1-2 coming into this fight. But hey, you take out a hype train like Johnny Walker, and for Johnny Walker in his last 2 fights, that's kind of been the trend. But for Nikita Krylov, who's next? Who do you see him fighting next at 205 pounds? It'd be interesting to see how that one goes. Because it's a division where, does John Jones stay at 205? Does he move up to 265? Very interesting stuff there. In your co-main event, Gilbert Burns and Damian Maia. Matt unfortunately picked Damian Maia, and I had Gilbert Burns in that fight. But Burns looked great. I mean, it looked like a UFC 3 combo that he threw. He just went left hook, stood there, did the taunt, and then jumps down for the ground and pound. And a great win for Gilbert Burns, who all of a sudden, again, calling out the majority of the UFC's roster at 170 pounds. Maybe jumps back to 155. I really doubt that, but you never know with a guy like Gilbert Burns, which makes it very interesting because at 170 pounds, we got some movers and shakers. And to really answer the question that was up at the top by Well Lad, who do you want to see fight Woodley this week? It's a good question, Well Lad. We'll get into our next portion of the show for an update of UFC London. And that's where this gets wonky, and we're going to get into my favorite segment of the show, the Twitter Purge.
It's time for the Twitter Purge.
All right, so you can see I've got Tapology up on my screen, but that's where it gets weird with the Twitter Purge, because in terms of the UFC, oh boy, we've got some controversy to say the least. I mean, listen, this is there's a lot of moving pieces with UFC London. If we look at it right now, I was over on Tapology before I came on to here, so I was looking at the entire card. There were a couple of fights that were dropped. You had former PFL and now UFC combatant taking on Bartosz Fabinski. MMA picks saying, is UFC in London canceled? That's where we're going with this. So on Tapology, they still had just about all the fights before I came on here live with everybody. And then I checked Tapology and I refreshed it before I came on here, and everything was gone. They said that all the fights were canceled, which was very interesting to see. So it's not looking good for the UFC. I mean, the tweet here from John Gooden, got to confess, I'm pretty low right now, so really sympathize with the athletes and UFC. It's a matter of terrible circumstances and so on and so forth. It's definitely not a good spot if you're a UFC fighter or somebody involved with the promotion. Of course, last night, and I pull it up here, you can see it from ESPN, Dana White during the broadcast or after the broadcast saying, yeah, we're going to continue with everything. I had the chance, like I said, to talk about it on Sportsnet's Fan 590 last night, and I said, hey, it's been rumored that the UK is going to cancel all public gatherings. You're not going to be able to have an event like this. And then they say, hey, we're going to move it to the Apex Center. We're just going to move London to the Apex Center on less than a week's notice. We've got, I know Kevin Holland was out there on Twitter saying, yeah, it should be good if we go over to London. If we come back, there's 13 approved airports in the States that we can fly into, get screened, and then head to whatever venue it is. And then it gets squirrely there. And I noticed in the comments, like you said, moving to the Apex Center. You can't really move to the Apex Center because it was also announced that by the Nevada State Athletic Commission, this was yesterday as well, the fact that due to coronavirus concerns, Nevada State is just going to pull every fight license until the 25th, which wouldn't really affect UFC Columbus or UFC Portland that they already scheduled to move to the Apex Center, because you had one on the 28th, you had one April 11th. But in terms of the event this weekend, they're kind of left out in the cold and in the dark, so to speak, because what do? I mean, where are you going to go? Are you going to go to a state that hasn't really put in place any of these precautions? It's very interesting to see what's going to happen in terms of moving UFC London and all these cards being canceled, which brings us to my next tweet from Jim Edwards. You recognize him maybe from Fighters Only magazine. He's with a ton of different organizations, MMA, NYTT. But yeah, he threw it out there, all the fights that were canceled, and this was 6 hours ago. Marshman Holland, Herbert Jacasey, McCann Smith, Roberts Dalby, which would have been a great fight, Amir Khani and Mike Grundy, Murphy, Benitez, Phillips, Todorovic, Fabinski, Rachmanov. Yeah, it's just a shame to see all these fights fall out. So this brings us to the next portion of it. Well, Leon Edwards said that today it's not worth it. You know, there's a lot of us together here. We're fathers, brothers, what have you, and it's just too difficult in this time where we got to be sticking with our families. So we continue on to Ariel Helwani, an email that was sent out to managers and reps about the new card next week that we're talking about right now. And oh boy, listen, basically anybody that's, you know, currently under contract from bantamweight to welterweight, we will find you a fight. But yeah, unless you don't have a P1 visa or you're an American resident, sorry, tough luck. So they're looking for anybody and everybody that can compete on this card, which brings us to Aaron Bronstetter's tweet from TSN. MMA manager tells me he's pitched roughly 40 different clients, 95% of them unsigned to the UFC matchmakers to compete on Saturday's event. Manager says that almost all those fighters have reached out proactively. I know over on Twitter, just a couple of fighters that have really thrown their names into the hat. Joe Giannetti, that you might recognize from The Ultimate Fighter, and Brian Kelleher. Both of those guys looking for fights, putting their names out there. But it's a sad spot to be in terms of UFC London having so many moving pieces. Graham Boylan also threw his name into the ring and said, hey, if there's some fighters that are already over in England, we'll try and fit you onto the Cage Warriors 113 card that we have coming up, which is always good to see because not only does Cage Warriors put on a great show, but there's quite a good relationship between them and the UFC. So Josh Talks UFC says, we need Colby to save this card. You read my mind. So if we continue through the tweets, just spoke to Tyron Woodley briefly, and oh boy, he wants to fight. He's ready to fight, and Colby Covington threw his name into the ring. So Colby Covington coming in to save the day, which is definitely a spot that you do not want to be in if you're the UFC, especially the way that Colby Covington was so brash, so outspoken before the fight with Kamaru Usman. He retreats into the shadows after losing. We don't hear too much from him now. I talked about it here recently, the video with Mixed Molly Whoppery. But Colby Covington, he was outspoken about fighter pay. He didn't want just a regular, average challenger's purse to fight Kamaru Usman. He thought that he deserved more. He just had a main event slot against Robbie Lawler where he won the interim belt and so on and so forth. And here we go. Is Colby Covington going to be the guy that saves the day? I don't know. But we continue on through. We've got the tweets from MMA Junkie, from Woodley and Covington. The bad blood is there. And that's where I think this is a good opportunity because this is the fight that a lot of people really wanted to see. I mean, AJ says, I'm excited for this, how the UFC are looking for anyone to compete. This is a great opportunity for those who've been given the chance to raise their stock. And typically with the UFC, unlike a Bellator, and you'll see this with Bellator, you'll see some fighters on the undercard. Maybe they have a 4-2 record. Maybe they have an 0-1 record. They get that one shot. They absolutely skyrocket. They put on a great performance. And then maybe, another fight and then a 3-fight deal, what have you. Typically with UFC, and maybe not in this case, but typically it's a 3-fight contract. Nothing's ever guaranteed, but typically they give you those 3 fights. Maybe you only get 1, maybe you only get 2, but it's a good opportunity for somebody to get their foot in the door. And with a good performance, hey, here we go. But in terms of Woodley and Covington, this is a fight that was already talked about. This is a fight that was supposed to happen way, way, way back when at UFC 227. You were supposed to get Colby Covington and Tyron Woodley, and then it just never happened. Now, Lad says, again, you guys are reading my mind here, but Dos Anjos said he would fight Woodley too. So we continue on through, and oh, by the way, Rafael Dos Anjos told UFC he's ready to, and willing to fight Tyron Woodley on 6 days' notice per sources. He said he can also make 171 too, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with this UFC London card, if something's kind of brought together. If we get to see something, whether it's 2 fights, 3 fights, what have you, which brings us on over and back to where we started with question mark kicks. Now, if we look ahead, we went through a UFC London update. Let me know what you're thinking about that one. And I'm going to move back up into the comments with MMA Picks saying Renan Barao signing contract with a local organization in Serbia. That was neat to see. We've got a lot of different, like I said, a lot of different moving pieces. I'm going to close some of my tabs here so I can get to some of the other ones. But yeah, it's a weird spot. UFC betting experience saying respect to any fighter stepping in. Great time yesterday. Now, in terms of the coronavirus and MMA, so we had KSW 53 postponed, canceled. We had Aries FC 2 canceled very early on. We've had Bellator where they went through the process of the weigh-ins. Then they had Media Day. They had all of that just to say right there, bam, hours before the event that they were going to cancel it, that they were going to scrap it, postpone it to later. But they did pay all the fighters their show money, which was really good to see, which really gets us into this coronavirus and MMA type of conversation. Where we're at right now is in the title of the show. But what do you do? What do you do if you're the UFC? Do you continue to scramble to try and put together whatever fight you can? And maybe you end up with a Bia Malecki, Veronica Macedo type of situation where it's some, fighters that, was that a UFC caliber fight? Who's to say? But do we end up with some fights that we typically see in the regional scene? Or do we end up with some fighters that, hey, we had no idea? Like, these are way out of left field, but they're on this card either way. I mean, the Columbus card, the Portland card, there's all sorts of good fights there. In that Jairzinho Rosenstrike fight against Francis Ngannou, you're going to get fireworks, but will that even happen? Will we see some of those fights moved closer? Who knows? I don't know. But in terms of coronavirus's effect on MMA, seems to be UFC last night was the only show in town. I know we had EFC from Pretoria over in South Africa. That went down. But in terms of what's coming up next, it's very, very tough to gauge. And then you look in terms of future events. So we're already on that conversation. We've got the Portland card. We've got the Columbus card. We've got UFC 249. I know that's a a conversation that we don't want to have. But Well Lad says, do you think no audience affects the fighters? To an extent, I think it would. I mean, you have to think it would affect the referees' decisions. It's going to affect the judges' decisions. It would have to affect the fighters as well. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be weird to see what we get next. And I know everybody's talked about it, the fact that we've had the main event for UFC 249 booked 5 times. 5 times. And we just finally wanted to see this fight between Tony Ferguson and Khabib Nurmagomedov. But will we get to see it in early 2020? Who knows? Will we have to wait until International Fight Week or longer? Who knows? But the reason why I brought up these two things in 2 different topics. So we've got coronavirus and MMA, and now we're into future events. UFC follows a different schedule. MMA follows a different schedule. We don't have a season structure like every single other, major sporting organization. We also don't have a fighters union either. So in terms of future events, you could have a potential to really logjam and end up with your mega cards, your UFC 217, your giant UFC 200, or what could have been UFC 200. We're in an awkward spot where, let's say that, we don't have MMA for the next 3 or 4 months due to the coronavirus or COVID-19. Maybe we end up with, a pay-per-view schedule where we have 1 or 2 every single month to the end of the year where you have multiple titles on the line at once. You have, your lightweight title and then your welterweight title. And on the next card, you have women's strawweight, flyweight, and bantamweight. You never know what we could get. And that's what makes this very interesting. The fact that, MMA doesn't follow a season format. And you know that as well as I know that. It's the best part about the sport because we just have more and more and more and more. And there's no off season. So with MMA, maybe finally we actually get a little bit of an off season. And I think in terms of future events, this really, really will possibly impact the PFL. Because what happens if maybe the PFL just goes in and says, hey, we've got all these fighters that we signed, the Rory McDonalds, the Justin Willises, the Jordan Youngs. There's been all sorts of good signings. And hey, we've already got small crowds and we've already got a lot of money invested. So maybe we don't need a big gate, which we've seen that from them. I mean, they'll go live from MSG, and it's big that it's MSG, but it's from the Hulu Theater. And in terms of attendance, it's not that big. You have to wonder how many tickets are comp, this and that. But hey, if they have a national audience on ESPN or ESPN2, you see it live up here in Canada on TSN, maybe they can pull a rabbit out of a hat. The PFL can gain out of this, especially where maybe their season starts a little bit later. You're going to run into a little bit of competition, but the fact that you're on during the week will really save you there. So for future events, it gets very interesting, which leads us into our 5th and final topic, your Fight Night picks. Let me know what you're thinking. I mean, oh boy, we're talking Charles Oliveira and Kevin Lee over in the comments, but let me know what you're thinking in terms of what's next. which of these cards are going to happen. What's going to happen with UFC London? What do you think about maybe the PFL, Bellator? We've seen KSW cancel an event. Maybe they double up and they go Sir Mix-a-Lot on us and they add a bunch of talent. I mean, Mariusz Pudzianowski was supposed to be on the next card. He dropped out due to injury. Maybe you get to see Puds in action next. Maybe you get to see somebody like Popek Monster. Who knows? But in terms of your fight night picks, let me know. Because, I mean, with us, with myself, and Matt, we love to cover all the different fighting leagues. It could be one championship who, again, they move some of their future cards just to Singapore. They're going to be possibly closed to the public, but it's a very dynamic and interesting situation. That was the purpose of, coming out with the show. The other purpose of having just this show, the way that it was set up, is the fact that normally on Sundays, what we're doing now, myself and Matt, we're doing our picks on Sunday night, putting them out just a couple of days earlier. It used to always be Tuesday. Now we're trying for late Sunday night, early Monday morning where we're at, getting those out so you can enjoy them. But where we don't know what's going to happen this week, it was kind of tough for Matt and I to decide, hey, do we do the London picks? Do we do Portland picks or Columbus picks and go way out on a limb? But there's not much sense in doing that. So I think for this week, what we're going to have is an episode like this. We just had question mark kicks. We'll have another episode of This Week in MMA. And if it happens, maybe an episode of Significant Strikes. But that's a good thing with Fight Night Picks, a chance that we have all of these different shows. Well Lad says, who you got if Colby and Woodley fight, and would you like to see win? It doesn't matter to me who wins. I know I get a little bit of flack here and there in the comments, and I can address this now. The fact that people say, what's your fighting background? You guys don't even fight. You don't even know what you're talking about. I'm a member of the MMA Journalists Association. I've been doing this with Fight Night Picks since 2018. I write for MMA On Point. So I feel like, a little bit, like I've got, some knowledge. I think I know what I'm talking about. MMA Pick says, have you heard one fighter, Anche Delia, fights in PFL and KSW? I think it's the greatest heavyweight talent. I think so as well. Really good talent there. And you're talking about PFL and KSW. KSW, a great heavyweight division. If you're a big KSW fan, you're going to know the fact that the former UFC fighter, Bellator fighter, M1 Global fighter, Phil DeFries has been just absolutely wrecking house there. But all sorts of good prospects. I like that you bring that name up. And if I can go to one of the other weight classes, Saladin Palmas from France at 135 pounds has looked like an absolute world beater. I mean, if we go through his record, just he absolutely destroyed Marcin Rotzek. Let's see, a little bit of an impromptu prospect to talk about, but Saladin Palmas, I mean, wow. At 145 pounds, rather, 14-0, definitely somebody to keep an eye on. And just to point out the fact that maybe some of the best fighters aren't in the UFC or they're not there yet. But yeah, I mean, all sorts of moving pieces. And like I said, to address the haters there, member of the Loudmouth MMA Podcast Network, and the fact that I've been doing a little bit of writing here and there for MMA On Point, as well as being a member of the MMA Journalists Association. In terms of Matt, he's done a little bit of jiu-jitsu in the past, and a little bit of kickboxing as well. So that's why the shows are kind of set up the way they are. We've had radio shows before. We actually had them from July to December of 2018 on a syndicated website. That was kind of neat to do. We've done all sorts of different things. AJ says Oliveira should go up in the rankings, face Donald Cerrone. Lee may look to fight the winner of Islam Makhachev and Alexander Hernandez. Now, what do I think about that? That's interesting because Kevin Lee wanted to fight the winner of Makhachev and Hernandez regardless. Even if he beat Charles Oliveira, that's who he wanted to fight. I think now in terms of rankings, that fight makes sense. Also, the question, Oliveira facing Donald Cerrone. I don't know if it'll happen at 155. I think Cerrone would probably move back down just to take that fight because you've got most finishes, most submissions, performance of the night. You can sell that one easily. That's a good main event for a fight night or a co-main event on a pay-per-view, all dependent on what we get for the rest of the year. And it plays into that whole season aspect, the fact that MMA doesn't have a season, but now the clock's going to start ticking on 2020. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with the rest of the year. So good question by AJ. MMA Picks also saying, what do you think about Stipe DC trilogy? That's a tough one. That's a really tough one. We covered that over on the Loudmouth MMA Podcast Network on Thursday night with Early Stoppage, myself and John Franklin. You can find him on Twitter at SMCornerman. But we talked about that, the fact that Stipe, the eye injury, and the question that we had was, Does DC, owe it to Stipe to have a third fight, or vice versa? Who owes who here? I don't think anybody owes anybody anything. These guys are at the point of their career where Stipe is arguably the best heavyweight of all time, and so is DC. But these guys have families. Like, Stipe just had a kid last year. DC already has a family. DC has the speaking engagement with the UFC where he's on the broadcast team. He's a coach of a high school wrestling team. He's the head guy at AKA in terms of fighter, player, owner, coach, like Jackie Moon. And Stipe, it's kind of the same story. I mean, this is a guy that, you might say he sounds like he's stuck in a wood chipper in those Modelo commercials or what have you. But this is a guy that he can be articulate when he needs to be. He can certainly talk well about the fight game. And, still involved with firefighting as well. So these are guys that they're not totally, they're not too far gone. That much is true. They're ranked so highly, and one of them's a champ. So we're not slighting them here by any means. But they're near the end of their career. And do they need to suffer any more trauma than is necessary? I don't think so. So the question being, what do you think about the trilogy? I think it doesn't need to happen. I know, they're tied. You want to see the rubber match, but it's just one that it doesn't necessarily have to happen. But it's a good question nonetheless. MMA picks, AJ, lad, UFC betting experience. Everybody, thanks so much for joining today with question mark kicks. Like I said, kind of up in the air what we're going to do with the picks this week. If UFC London or something emerges this week, be sure to tune in. We will have those picks. Make sure you click the bell notification for those, because sometimes when we put out, 12 or 13 videos at a time, they get lost out there on the internet. And you can always find us on Twitter and Instagram at Craig Allen FNP, at Matt Allen FNP, and at Fight Night Picks. I just made an Instagram page for us for at Fight Night Picks, but you can find us over on Twitter as well. Fight Night Picks on Facebook. We're all over the place. And then the website as well, fightnightpicks.net. I've got one of the shirts on here. We had the giveaway. I just had the chance to send out some of that stuff here recently as well. So should be in the mail. Fingers crossed that you get that as soon as it comes out. But all sorts of stuff going on with Fight Night Picks. We really appreciate everybody for tuning in. And as always, like we like to say, and it's a little bit weird when I'm here by myself without at Matt Allen, but let's get into it.
It's time
For 15 minutes of non-stop MMA, tackling the biggest news in the sport. Head into the chat and let us know how you feel. Live from Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, here's your host, Craig Allen.